Hello, Myth Nation. Hope you're well out there. Final Screenside Chat. We had to move things at the last minute. Thanks for being patient with us. Here's our last voyage into the world of live myth discussions. As usual, we will have our questions coming in. Whatever comes up during the session, please post it to the appropriate discussion forum on the Coursera site, and we'll try to get to it by the end of class. We've got a few that highlights that we've drawn out of the discussion forums in the last few weeks that we're going to pull out for discussion today among us. And maybe we'll just do our usual introductions. Peter Struck is my name. I've been lecturing to you over the last, gosh, has it been 9 weeks now? No, 8 weeks. Is it 9? Are we?
I think this is week 9. This is week 9.
Okay, so yeah, maybe I'm a familiar face. Nice to see you all again. And I'll let you introduce yourself, Sam.
I'm
Dr. Sam.
That's right. I'm Sam Beckelheimer. I just recently finished the grad program here at Penn. I guess that's me. Anna.
Hi everybody. I'm Anna. I'm another, well, still grad student at Penn, and I'm in England right now, which is why I'm on a separate video stream.
Right. So you've had some busyness this week. The writing assignment has come out, and people have been busy with that. There were a few questions that have come up, about what to write on, and some folks are really interested in writing on Ovid, which is completely understandable. But we don't have the lectures yet of Ovid. If you're wondering, is it okay for me to write on Ovid, even though we haven't seen the lectures yet? Absolutely. Please, go ahead. And those of you all who are going to be in a position to evaluate essays that talk about Ovid, just realize that those have been written without access to the lectures first for what they're worth. So just, keep that in the back of your mind. But we don't have any proscription on material that you haven't seen lectures on. You all by now, I think, probably have a pretty, you've got, the rules of the road, how these writing assignments work, having done them once already, and you've got some idea about how these live lectures fill things in, so you can anticipate that there are some areas that I'll be covering, but if you feel like you've got some things that you want to jump in on, by all means, please do. So yeah, thanks for keeping the discussions really robust. Usually, I've taught this course several times in the past, and usually something always goes wrong, or something kind of funky starts to happen on the boards, and we have to jump in. But you all are a really nice group. It seems like you. We haven't had any flags go up saying, "Uh-oh, we got to jump in on this one." So anyway, keep that up. One thing I've noticed, I think the general bonhomie and supportiveness of the boards is great. But I also want to just toss in one thing to see how you all react to this. As you're making all your postings to the board, yes, for sure, be polite to everyone else, but I don't think you should fear disagreement. I think that, and I've noticed some of the threads that have disagreed with some things that have come up in lecture, some of which I've weighed in on, some of which I actually don't have, can't weigh in on all of them. I've been very happy to see these kinds of things, and I've noticed that some other students are weighing in and saying, hey, don't disagree with gosh, you should disagree with the professor. And if we were all together in a classroom, we would spend a lot of time disagreeing with each other. That's how we advance our understanding. So please don't be shy about disagreeing with me or anyone else as politely as you've been doing. That's fine. But don't be shy about that. Disagreement is actually a good thing. It helps us sharpen our views and advances our understanding. Always bringing in nuance is a good thing. So please keep them robust and active at the same time as you're keeping them as polite as you have been. Now we've got some questions from the boards that I think we'll start with, unless there's other advanced discussion that we should have. Anna or Sam?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so let's see. It looks like, Sam, you're going to start us off?
Yeah, so I noticed, well, we've shifted to Roman mythology now. We're reading Virgil, and maybe it'd be nice to start with some general comments about the difference between Greek mythology and Roman mythology, because these are cultures that are not only 400 years apart or so from our latest Greek author and our earliest Roman author, but they're just vastly different because of geographical language differences as well. So I've kind of condensed a number of questions that I saw in the threads that sort of related to this. I'll just give quick nods to Christopher Praley and Karen Carlson, who posted some of these questions, but just some maybe basic foregrounds on what what does this shift mean from going from Greek mythology to Roman mythology, and maybe talk a little about how the Romans co-opted some of the Greek things and how that influences their way of imagining their own mythological world.
Yeah, for sure. This is another one of those questions I could talk about forever. I'll try to make my answer as crisp as I can. It's probably not the case that we should, start off by thinking, oh, look, here's all these Greek gods. They were preset, and the Romans just took them and gave different names to them. That's unlikely to be a good, even thumbnail description of what happened. Instead, what we have is lots of very rich Mediterranean traditions that are floating around about different gods and goddesses that have different kinds of purviews and powers. Different cities adopt different of these divinities, and those traditions that have to do with the divinities get modified and shaped for the needs of any particular city that pulls up a god to be their main figure. So we've got pre-existing traditions that Greeks adopt and that Romans adopt, and as we all know from moving on to Virgil here, the city of Rome has been around for a long time. 750 BCE is a reasonable starting point for what when the city of Rome began. That's well before the Athenians are coming up with definitive statements of their own versions of Greek mythology. In other words, the Romans are busy creating their own mythology well before Virgil's time, and well before concurrent with the kinds of things that are happening in classical Athens. So we've got a dynamic process in which multiple traditions are being assembled in different points around the Mediterranean in ways that each culture wants to do. Now, the Romans will surely be talking in a way that eventually talks about one or the other of their gods as being identical with this or that Greek god. That they definitely say that. That's, I think, best understood as a kind of process by which, when cultures get to know one another, they tend to assimilate that foreign culture, in this case it would be the Greeks, to their own home culture, the Romans. So when they run into something that the Greeks do, they'll say, oh yeah, you've got a goddess of love, well so do we. Yours must be the same one we have, just you use this other name. We call her Venus, you've got Aphrodite. Now, I think it would be a little bit of a mistake to say, and therefore they're the same. The Romans think that, and that's fine, and they're doing that as a kind of way of helping make sense of a plethora of different traditions, but that doesn't mean that we need to think that as well. So the Romans are doing creating mythologies as any culture does around the Mediterranean, and they're using the bricks and mortar that pre-existed them to make up their own sense of what's going on. Now, what's distinctive about the Romans? Well, we've spent some time talking about the contrast between Virgil's hero Aeneas and Odysseus, and Homer's hero Odysseus. And I think that's a really useful way of eliciting some specific some starting specifics to the conversation of what's distinctive about Roman mythology. We should also remember that the Romans have a kind of different theological perspective toward what's happening. Since the Greek materials that we've been studying in the classical period, there are whole different ways of imagining how the gods work. Influential Stoicism, Epicureanism, some of you all who have followed the history of philosophy will know how these schools radically change people's views on how the gods operate and how they work, and I think that influences the mythological traditions. For example, the way in which Virgil's gods tend to be a bit more remote. I mean, look at Jupiter and how he behaves in the first 6 books of the Aeneid. He's quite remote, and when he operates, it's only through lots of different intermediaries. He's quite august and grand. That remoteness of the divinities, Juno excluded, but that general remoteness of the divinities, I think, is part and parcel of a different kind of theological perspective that's being developed in Virgil's time, which says that, yes, we've got these mythological traditions that are around. They may well relate in some way or other to the divine, such as the divine really is, but mostly what they are is great stories, and we should understand what's happening in these myths as being, first and foremost, really good stories. That version of these myths is much more robust during Roman times than it was during the Greek material, and that's all because of developments in the theological perspective that they have. So it's a long-winded answer, but it's a great question, and it's something that no single specific answer is going to be good enough to put to rest. It's something that is perfect for discussion on the boards, and I see it's already started, so just keep it going. Anything else?
That was very thorough. I think, Anna, well, we have a few related questions that maybe we'll just kind of go into.
Yeah, I'll jump into the next one because it's sort of related about how how the Romans are positioning themselves in relation to the Greeks. And then with Virgil, we've obviously got the Trojans in here as well. So we had a question on the boards from Sonny Kancha Das. So I'm probably not saying that right. My apologies. So she was asking, why is Virgil and the Romans connecting themselves to Troy? Are the Trojans Greek? You know, what's going on there? Why are these three groups? What's the relationship between them that Virgil's putting together?
Well, it's a great question, and we can ask historically what the relationship is, and then we can ask what Virgil's making of the history in order to suit the needs that he has. Historically, these are three separate cultures around the Mediterranean. The Greeks, Trojans, and Romans are ethnically distinct, great civilizations that have their own trajectories. They have connections with one another in the way that this corrupting sea connects the cultures around the Mediterranean. You know, Greeks knew about Romans, and Romans knew about Greeks, and the same thing with the Trojans. They were familiar with each other's background. Now, we don't have any corroborating evidence to Virgil's claim that the Romans originally came from the Trojans. We don't have any corroborating evidence of that. We've got long traditions. Now, let me just put it we've got long traditions before Virgil where people make these claims of linkages to a Trojan background, but we don't have hard-nosed archaeological records or any kind of literary evidence. That would be sort of hard to imagine what it would be, but any kind of literary or archaeological evidence that leads us to propose that yes, indeed, there was this offshoot from the area of Troy that got into a boat and went over and founded Italy. We've got no corroborating evidence for that. So there's no reason to endorse that claim. Virgil makes the claim. So for him, it's very important to say that there is this genetic linkage between the Trojans in antiquity and the Romans. And in fact, remember what he does as a kind of extra spin to that in Book 4. He talks about, well, actually, really originally, if you want to know where the Trojans themselves came from, they came from the shores of Italy, and then they eventually left and founded Troy, and then they went back and refounded Rome. Even more fanciful. So we have even less than none corroborating evidence for that part of the story as well. So we can see with Virgil's making a relationship between the Romans and the Trojans, one that pre-existed him, but he's giving a definitive stamp to it that claims this descent and this lineage. Now, what do they get from this? Well, the Romans get an anchoring in a very grand past. It's a past that has to do with all of the Homeric legacy that's so rich, and many cultures do different things with the Homeric legacy to try to inherit it in their own way around the Mediterranean. The Romans do this for sure via their linkage with this Trojan group. Now, they're going to claim a kind of grandeur, and when you look at in the Iliad, which I hope you'll have time to read at some point, you look at the Iliad, the Trojans come off extremely well. They're very noble, they're terrific soldiers, and they actually come off in some ways more admirable, in many ways more admirable than the Greeks. So knowing that Homeric lineage, there's no downside really to affiliating yourself with Troy through the Homeric lens. The downside comes in the fullness of the tradition, which says that the Trojans lost. So the Romans are affiliating themselves with losers. However, they can talk about that in a grander perspective from the vantage point of real historical Roman time, which in the 2nd century BC, third century BC, the Romans had already militarily clobbered the Greeks. So the Romans can go ahead and say, yeah, we're from that group that you beat at one point, but we came back and annihilated you in spades. So, they can sit from the vantage of this has been a long struggle between our cultures, and, we may have lost them, but eventually we annihilated you. And they did decisively. Just absolutely decisively. So the Greeks were gone militarily. So there's ways in which they're going to build this linkage sensitive to the different kind of concerns that come up in a fuller discussion of it. The main thing I think that Virgil's getting from it is this clear axis from Roman time back into the greatest of Greek legends of the Trojan War.
I'll just add to that the Romans were acutely aware that by the time they encountered Greece, they were sort of a fully realized, artistic, very, very culturally advanced society. And in a lot of ways, Romans they wanted that for themselves, and they ended up, importing a lot of Greek culture and sort of being able to tie themselves back to this mythological past maybe justifies that a little bit. I mean, the Roman poet Horace very famously says, captive Greece captured Rome, basically, saying that, we may have militarily defeated Greece and subjugated them and put them into our empire, but at the end of the day, we're really dependent on them for a lot of our cultural institutions and the things that we regard as hallmarks of culture. So there's definitely some cash in being able to tie your big Roman empire back to this puny little, well, at least mythologically sanctioned event in history.
Right. And then, Anna, I want to run something by you. When I teach this class live, as these two guys know, here at Penn, I make reference usually in class at this point to the relationship between the Americans and the Brits. I don't remember if that connection shows up in the Coursera lectures. I think I may have excised it for the larger audience. But in the more informal live chat, maybe I can just bring it out. And I wonder what Anna, who's currently in England, would ever think of this. I don't know if I've ever asked you, Anna, but you'll remember, at this point in the lecture, I talked to the American college students in the audience and reference, well, you know how there's this British culture out there, right? And Americans tend to think of the Brits as being quite fancy and well-cultured. And sometimes Americans will get a little chip on their shoulder about that. Yeah, they'll resent the Brits, and sometimes they'll pat the Brits on the head and say, yeah, you used to be a superpower, but no more. And it's this weird kind of thing where there's a, on the one hand, slightly blustery attitude toward the Brits, swaggering around and saying, well, we have bigger missiles than you. This is the Americans saying this. But on the other hand, there's a certain kind of cultural inferiority complex that I think my people, these American people, also have toward the Brits. Anna, what is your reaction to that analogy? And I wonder if it holds up at all. Just tossing it out for conversation.
I mean, I think it definitely does. And even among friends that I have in the US, there's sometimes a little bit of jesting, a little bit of rivalry about this kind of thing. Like you said, we beat you, we kicked you out of our country. But on the other side, on the British side, I think sometimes we probably have the same as the Greeks, that we need to kind of make ourselves feel superior in some way. So it's perhaps about humor or food or other things that we can be more, or our longer history, so that we can definitely claim to that side of things. So there's definitely the jostling between the two is friendly, but there's an undercurrent there too that we're not going to whitewash over the past in some ways.
Right. And chauvinism is just kind of chauvinism. In some way, it never changes. And then the specifics of any particular iteration of chauvinism are always rich, culturally complex, very rich and culturally complex. We'll find some analogies in comparisons between chauvinistic manifestations at different times in history, and then differences too. So yeah, all these things have to do with stereotypes. None of them, I think, have much reality to them. Nevertheless, right, as we've said several times in the class, just because something's completely fabricated and culturally specific doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, sometimes these things like stereotypes and chauvinisms become very important in cultural self-understanding. So we need to make gestures to them, I think, to elicit them and then study them as best we can without any of the cant and chauvinism that happens in the rest of lived life. Okay, so let's see, where to next?
I think we're sort of moving our way into more specific Aeneid questions, and I think this is a good place to start. Erica Ramirez posted a question. I think you said that the version of the founding of Rome that you're familiar with involves these two figures, Romulus and Remus, these two brothers, and that may be a familiar myth to others as well. But here we are dealing with the Aeneid, which is also purportedly the foundation of Rome, or at least the foundation of the Roman culture, and it's got an entirely different character here who's supposed to be the founder. So I guess how do we reconcile that Rome gets these two foundation myths? And I mean, they're clearly linked, and if you go through the whole Aeneid, you'll see that a little more clearly. But is there something else that we need to say about why there are two of these, or why did Virgil in this instance at this time choose to promote Aeneas in that version of the foundation as opposed to the other one?
So I think I'd like to jump in here. on this question. I think the first thing comes to my mind is to say that, in a way, I don't think it's that unusual. So if you've only been familiar with one before and then this other one comes up, maybe it's going to seem very strange to you. But if we think about how cultures work, how societies work, and how complex they can be, that we probably all have different origin stories for ourselves and our countries and where we come from. And we're okay with the fact that there's that multiplicity to it. And it's changing, it's developing. And so now with Virgil, he's pulling on Aeneas very strongly. And there could be various reasons for that. One of them I always think about is that if we think about the recent history, Rome and Augustus, they've just come through these horrific civil wars that they've torn themselves apart. And it's basically fratricide, which if we think about the Romulus and Remus story, that's exactly what you have in there. It's something that I think of the Roman imagination, they think they can't quite escape. It's there at their very beginning. But it's also a reason why right now, now war is over, we've got peace again, the Romans aren't maybe going to want to celebrate that myth to such a great degree. So then Virgil can choose this other one to bring out and build their history off and connect Augustus back to. So those are the main things I would say about that. I don't know, Peter, Sam, if you have other things to add.
I usually can't stop talking, so I'll just I won't break precedent here. I think it's worth just underscoring how you started, that wherever we look in the foundation stories of cultures, we're always going to find a multiplicity. It's just what you run into. And I don't know of any, I can't think of any example of a clean, clear, this is where we came from, this is how it all started, thoroughly agreed upon, widely agreed upon, understood history. The stakes are too high for unitary versions of these things. The stakes always get a little cloudy and a little muddy once lived life enters into a cultural inheritance.
I'm not sure I have too much to add to that, but or at least too much to augment the answer to that question with. But I'll just point out one thing that I think is really interesting that's related to both of these questions of kind of putting a historical, mythological starting point to the culture, is that this is something the Romans are really interested in doing in a way that maybe doesn't fully come out in the Greek, which is having sort of a complete and uninterrupted continuum from their foundation all the way to the present day. And you definitely get that in Virgil, and I'm not sure we really saw that to the same extent in any of the Greek myths we've read. The historical mythological interaction is not really as strong, I think, in Greek, but that's maybe somewhat related to this interest in kind of locating the foundation of the city with this kind of traceable trajectory back to where we are. But yeah, that's not really answering so much the question as it is just kind of a comment that came to my head as we were sitting here.
Cool.
So can I move us on to something similar to do with the Aeneid? So we had some discussion on the boards about how was the Aeneid received. Well, I think there was one question that said, how was the Aeneid received in Virgil's lifetime? Which is obviously a little bit difficult considering that he died before it was fully finished, so it wasn't fully published kind of thing before that. But anyway, how was it received very, very early on? Did people believe this? If we're now in a time when myth is in a time of history, how are the Romans joining together their history and their myth? And we have one person, I think, also a Peter, asking about Livy and how that then fits in there as well. So how was the Aeneid received soon after it was made public?
That's a great question. Do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and I'll at least answer part of the first part of that question is how was it received in its own period. Yeah, and obviously Virgil died before he actually got a chance to publish it and make all the edits that he wanted, and was actually in his will he wanted it thrown on the fire, which thankfully it was rescued. But even before his death, when he was still working it, his close connection with Augustus meant that he had Augustus and some of the other intellectual and social elites of Rome as early audiences, and he did recite it to Augustus, or at least a couple books, I think maybe 2, 4, and 6, which we all looked at, so you got a point of reference there. And to critical acclaim, I think Augustus's sister supposedly fainted when she heard Virgil, as he was reciting it, mention her son Marcellus as sort of we're tying the mythological past to the present. So you got that nice little anecdote. Something that you probably won't come across in just about in any other discussion of Virgilian reception, unless you're kind of a dork for Roman grammatical tradition like I am. Even shortly after Virgil's life, there was a professional teacher, a grammarian named Quintus Caecilius Epiroda, who was already teaching Virgil in his classroom. So this was only, probably less than a decade. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly when these guys were operative, but he was certainly a contemporary with Virgil, and shortly after the Aeneid was made available broadly after Virgil's death, that is, he was already taking it and teaching it in his classroom to his students. So it had legs very quickly in Rome, and obviously its legacy is continued from there. And it later periods, it was Virgil becomes the poetic touchstone for Roman literature. So very immediately, that process begins and kind of continues and explodes later. Maybe I'll pass off the sort of broader question about myth and history and how they interact and how that especially works here, whether people believed it, to you, Peter, and see what you think.
Yeah, these are already thorough answers to the question. See if I have anything new or separate to add. I don't think I do. I think you all have got it. So I am speechless. That's good for once. Yeah.
Well, I'll move on since we're firmly talking about the historical context of this, and I've mentioned Augustus, so he's a good person to bring in now. I think Teresa Mushik asked a question about the Aeneid as a piece of propaganda, as a piece of Augustan propaganda. And, well, if that's the case, what is it accomplishing? Some people have actually read it the opposite way and thought that maybe it's being subversive of Augustus's regime. But maybe I'll throw that out and see what you two think about the Aeneid as a vehicle for Augustan propaganda.
Yeah. I resist usually when I'm getting started on conversations like this. I want to start off by resisting the term propaganda. Propaganda, I think, is something you can spray paint on the side of a bus. It's not something that comes in tens of thousands of lines, carefully constructed, particularly in tens of thousands of lines that are so rich as Virgil's are. Now, if the question is, does the end state of Virgil's epic, complex though it is, right? I would disagree with someone who said it wasn't complex. Is the end state of Virgil's epic a ringing endorsement of Augustus's regime? It's a longer statement, but I assume that's what's meant by propaganda, but I just want to make sure I toss that out. Is the end state of Virgil's text a ringing endorsement of Augustus' regime? I don't think so. I just, and I made my case for that in the lectures. There are too many points at which the back currents of history are dwelled on by Virgil. They would have been easy enough to gloss over. We could have had a single straightforward story about grand glory awaiting and having it being fulfilled. Virgil's epic is anything but that. It's quite dark, and there's typically in Virgilian characterizations, there's a superficial level that's very apparent and easy to get to. Then the further one reads and the more one works on it, there's almost always another and then another and then another layer of things in which you're going to say to yourself, my gosh, that the whole point of what I just read just changed. I read Homer every year and sometimes more than once a year, and I can say with confidence that each year I can pick up something new, and that something new is like a little brick that gets tucked into the wall. The edifice of my knowledge of Homer adds little bricks each time I go through it. With Virgil, that's happening at the same time, but also the whole wall moves. I'll kind of find a little piece that fits up here, and then all of a sudden I'll get to some new characterization that seems to change the entire big picture of what Virgil's up to. So, I can't tell you the number of times I've gone through the text that we read for this class, text 1 through 6, and come up with some just completely different realization of what I think book 4 is doing, or what I think book 3 is up to, or what's happening in book 1. Where, so anyway, just by way of saying that if you think you've got Virgil, read it again, because you may not have it. And I say that with some caution, because on the extreme of this, I just want to resist straight, clear characterizations that Virgil's clearly doing X. But I also want to be careful not to toss everything into some kind of murky soup, which says that any claim is always going to be a little wrong, so don't even bother. Que sera, sera. We'll all just wash our hands of this weird thing. It's the last refuge of the lazy-minded to say, oh yes, it's very complex. But it's also the case that it's true with Virgil. It's very complex. So it just puts more demands on making advances in our understanding. I think we're even in a more demanding territory than I think we are even with Homer. So, Anna, do you have things to add for that too?
Yeah, I was thinking with this question that it's sort of a good example of how our readings in classical scholarship have changed over time, that I think if we go back far enough, scholarly works on Virgil and on the Aeneid are going to be taking it as that kind of very close connection with Augustus, a very positive view building into the sort of current political climate. And then our readings have kind of developed, and I think there's one sort of reading that Virgil is that kind of positive glow, and then all the kind of negative dark stuff ends up in our later epics that are coming along, Lucan, Statius, Silas Italicus, that we start getting much murkier. But then I think our readings and our scholarly readings have moved on even further now, that we think we can find that darkness in Virgil as well. And that isn't to say that there aren't positive connections with Augustus in the present time, but like you were saying, it is complex, and the more, even in 100 years of classical scholarship, we've gone through those different layers, and I'm sure there's more to go. So if you, when you first read it, were thinking more along these lines of the propaganda side of things, then that's kind of what we've done too, and we've then moved on and are at a different stage of scholarship now.
Okay. Yeah. That's good. Okay. Well, I think I wanted to ask a question that I didn't actually get on the boards, but I was thinking about this afternoon as we were sort of preparing, and it's basically about using our tools on the Aeneid and what sort of considerations we need to have when we're doing that, because these obviously are different texts. If you go back all the way to Homer, that seems very much ingrained in the kind of cultural moment of the people who are telling the myth. And maybe as you drift farther along and the people who are telling become more aware that this is now a literary form and we're kind of reusing it and recycling different aspects and promoting different aspects that are significant to our story, things start to change. But by the time you've reached the Aeneid, what you've got in the Aeneid is the mythology is a bit more synthetic, I think, than you would actually call Homer. It may be unfair to say Homer is purer as a mythological document than Virgil is, but it still, to me, warrants a discussion on how these tools behave a little bit differently, and whether we as myth analysts need to think about these texts as behaving differently and as the myths in the text behaving differently, and whether or not we need to think, or at least have that in mind as we're trying to apply the tools for myth analysis.
I think that's a very productive question, and I'll just have a few thoughts to get started with. Some of the mythic materials or mythic tools that we're working with in the class are predicated on the idea that what we're going to do is kind of capture myth right at its origin, just as kind of popping up out of people's brains. We're going to jump in there and understand myth from that moment of creation. One point where this is clear in the four tools that we have is myth and ritual, and there are other tools that do an analogous kind of thing with different perspectives that we haven't included in the class. But myth and ritual is based on the idea that what you're going to do is kind of find this moment of emergence of the myth, and the moment of emergence is going to be out of ritual. There's going to be some ritual behavior that needs explanation, and the story's going to start to get told about that. And then there's a whole mythic tradition that will take off after the story gets started. So you can't, it's very difficult, if those of you who tried, to do a myth and ritual reading of Virgil. It's not impossible, but the results you get, let's just put it this way, in the results I've seen when people have tried to use myth and ritual with Virgil, the results have not been all that productive. There have been much more helpful work done on the Homeric hymns, on Hesiod. I think myth and ritual is indispensable in some of these earlier Greek texts. However, it's not as useful in the case of Virgil. Now, why is that? Well, I think pointing to the idea that Virgil is self-consciously constructing a literary form based on precedents, that's a critical thing to enter into. I think there's, it would be absurd to make a claim that Virgil was trying to explain some ritual behavior about, that the Romans were engaged in through this all the pieces of this epic. I'm just not sure that a person could make a creditable case like that. You could zoom in on a few points. I mean, we've got some dancing horses that happen during the funeral games, the way the funeral games happen. There's ways that we can point to certain things in there that answer to myth and ritual, but it's thin beer compared to the main stuff that's happening in the story. Contrast, functionalism. Boy, functionalism, you have a field day with a story that's self-consciously constructed, like Virgil's is, to be the statement of a culture and its values and what it's all about. That's functionalism is ready to tackle a myth that's developed in such kind of a precedent. So I think functionalism is very helpful. Structuralism, no problem. Structuralism is not exactly interested in the origin of a myth, except to claim that it's something that comes out of a human mind. And myths get analyzed like literary productions, like the production of poetry, like any self-conscious production of human culture. Myths get analyzed by the same basic understanding of how the human brain works as anything else does. So you can use structuralism just as well, I think just as productively, with later, more self-conscious kinds of mythic constructions like Virgil, as you can with early manifestations of the, and by early I just mean early with respect to our literary record in the Greek stuff. In the case of Freud, I think to some extent Freud's view, which remember for this class we're trying to take a very particular piece of what Freud's all about. I noticed a lot of robust discussion on the Freudian tool on the boards in the last several weeks. And what we want to point to in this class is that Freud's main claim, this is the one we're interested in, which is that we're not masters in our own psychological houses, that there are urges inside of us over which we don't have control, and that dreams are gives us a window in which we can indulge these desires, even though some of them were going to be prescribed, and that myths function as the dreams of an entire culture. Now, that's the key insight. Details on Freud, many of which our colleagues in the psychology department are no longer trumpeting, and in fact are running away from. The details, sure, let's go ahead and prune them out. And claims based on those details that don't have justification anymore, let's go ahead and reevaluate those. But still recoverable, this Freudian idea that says that myths allow expression of repressed desires. That's a fascinating tool. And I think when we put it to use, it probably has a little bit more useful application in the Greek materials, but still also very useful with the Roman materials. What we need to find is what we would have to claim if we're doing a Freudian reading of a text like Virgil is we'd have to find some manifestation of a repressed desire that the culture usually prescribes, but that this myth allows to come out and allows the readership to vicariously gratify through engagement with the myth. So it's that kind of a claim that we'd have to justify. And I think it's possible with Virgil, but probably a little less likely to find such a thing that we'd be happy with than it is in the case of, say, Hesiod. My goodness, how are you going to read Hesiod without Freud? I think you'd be crippled. There's so much in there that's answerable to the kind of description of how myths work that Freud made. So those are just some thoughts, but not to be used in an exclusive way, I think, as more of a start of a conversation. Okay?
Yeah.
So what's coming up? Do we have other things? Anna, do you have a last question? I can't remember, or are we going to go right to the boards?
No, I think we're going to go to the boards and then just have a closing thought about the course.
Good. So what do we see?
Well, so most recent question I've got here is, this one actually, Peter, I think you'll quite like. It's about numbers, the number 3 in particular.
Okay.
Is there some significance to the fact that people are trying things 3 times always? This is asked by D. Jean Dyson. She quotes the. I'm going to actually. This is a beautiful statement. The mathematical perfection of the structure of Virgil's Aeneid. Is there something to the numerology of the Aeneid, and particularly the number 3 here.
Oh, that's deep waters, and I don't know that we'll fathom them today. But yeah, I think that the number 3 is particularly useful, and it does show up. 3 tends to be there and most useful as a way of making sure everyone knows that something is really the case. If you say something once, it could just be coincidental. Something that happens twice, outside chance that it could be coincidental. If something happens 3 times in a row, there's no chance that it's not that it's coincidental, and it authorizes what's being said or claimed as being an actually true thing. You'll see this, that it shows up in the context of jury trials as well. You have to swear that something is really the case, and after you've done that, then everything's okay. It happens in ritual contexts of other kinds. 3 times is a charm. Once could be an accident, second could be just a coincidence, and third, but the third time removes all doubt and makes sure it's true. Now that said, the kind of tracking down of numerological questions, I have seen more thrilling propositions based on numerological assumptions about the myths. I've seen more like that than I've seen using almost any other method. But I don't know that I've ever seen numerological analyses that have really, rung true. It's so enticing. You get in there and you say, yeah, let's look at this number sequence here and that number sequence there. It's just so hard. Now, when you start to draw literary parallels and say, look, it starts here and middle here and ends there, and there's 3 pieces of this picture, fine, like all that's going to work. But if you talk about 6 characters here and 7 over there, and there's got to be 8 over there, things just get all out of whack. Now, I'm not saying I'm giving up hope. But I'm saying that it's more often thrilling and exciting than it is convincing to me to go down numerological paths. So, and it's also true that it's never been the case that I found some stable referent to any particular number to say that 3 is the number of X, or 4 is a number that always means Y, or 5 always. It just doesn't happen. Cultures just do what they need to do with these different. In this case, measurable differences between these quantities.
I'm going to combine two somewhat related questions on the boards here. One was from Montserrat Washburn, the other is from Ivan Neething, both having to do with Xenia and how that relates to, if it relates to the Aeneid at all. I think Montserrat wants to know if I actually just posited that pietas is sort of the counterpart to Xenia, and as far as a cultural value that is really promoted and put to the forefront in the epic. And then Ivan Neething wanted to know whether there was a Roman Xenia, because obviously it's not really at the forefront of the Aeneid, this kind of idea of guest-host relations, but whether.
Yeah. Oh, sure. There surely was. And you talk, the Romans had a whole vocabulary of talking about the way you should entertain a guest. But from Virgil's repackaging of things, it's not going to be front and center anymore. And I think he purposely tells his story in such a way to set up a clash between this most Homeric of virtues with his new virtue of pietas, especially in the case of Dido. It seems self-consciously constructed. I mean, she gives archetypal Xenia to Aeneas, and Aeneas has to turn his back on that and walk away from it, and he has to do that because of pietas. So I think Virgil self-consciously constructed a story in which these two things are going to come into conflict in order to assert the supremacy of one over the other. Now, it's not to say that all of a sudden Xenia is a bad thing in Virgil's world. It's just it can't be as important as the other. These kinds of discussions will come up. And those of you, well, I think probably most of you who are taking this course are involved in complex things in life that are more complex than the kind of things that you run into maybe when you're in grade school or junior high or, gosh, even in college. And, the really tough choices in life are almost always between 2 really good things or 2 really bad things. It's never between 1 good thing and 1 bad thing. It's never the way it works out. I mean, those are not choices. Those choices already get made. And it's not like, I mean, there'll be my son's 13, and there's TV shows that he watches, and they have these kind of these plots. The kids get into some adventure. There's a short and easy path that's actually kind of is bad, but it's attractive, so because it's kind of pleasurable or it's titillating. So someone goes ahead and does that, and then by the end of the show, the kids all come back together, and that person learns the lesson that the short, easy path you should never take, and you should always do the good thing. Well, that's fine, but that's pretty thin gruel when it comes to making difficult, complex moral decisions in the real world. It's always between two good things or two bad things. So, in the case of these cultures, you've got, obviously, Xenia is a good thing, and Pietas is a good thing. It's not like they're bad. The Greeks would have said that. But what you've got is there, in the complexity of life, you'll have to rank order good things when they come into conflict. Every case that's decided in a prominent court in a functioning government is always going to be between. There's going to be great arguments on both sides. You just have to figure out an evaluation of which good thing is better than the other good thing, and that's a very hard thing to do. Anyway, that's what's happening in this epic, and it's part of what culture building is all about. So. Probably a longer answer than you.
No, that's great. That was 2 questions in one, so that's great. I don't know, maybe Anna, do you want to pose the sort of final question that we were thinking about?
Sure. So I think in one of the forums we had a nice question from Fatima Morley saying she's really loved the course and really interested in mythology. So wanted some suggestions for where to go next for continuing to study and think about myth. So, do we have thoughts and suggestions for Fatima and the rest of the class?
Oh, there's so many things to do. There's a great Coursera class on ancient Greece, a history class taught out of Wesleyan by my colleague Andy, whose last name I have a hard time pronouncing always, but it's a great class. You should think about that. And then, reading on your own is wonderful things to do. I think we talked a little bit last time about books that we would do, and I would definitely do the Iliad. I'm thinking at some point that another Coursera class would be in the offing that I would do on the Iliad, and we'll see. Greg Naj's course over on edX is another take on mythology that is based on the hero, and he's a particular specialist in archaic Greece, so it's concentrating on what's happening in the Homeric hero culture, and then its legacies and its prehistory. There's wonderful things that come out of that course. And Nagy is spelled N-A-G-Y. That's a course on edX. I'm trying to think of what else. I think that the popular culture manifestations of this, I don't myself, I'm not as well schooled in these as others are, but I think it's just great that this stuff is going on, and it's good for us, those of us interested in it, to see contemporary remakings of it. For me, though, always, there's nothing like reading Homer and Virgil. There's just nothing like it, or the playwrights we've seen, or any of the material we've seen in the class. Not to say that the others I poo-poo. It's just there's just nothing like this stuff that you all have been spending all this time working so hard on doing. I hope you've come to a conclusion that's at least somewhat like that. And what other things should folks be doing that are interested in mythology, Anna or Sam?
I would maybe say you get a really good sense of how the Greeks thought about their myths if you read some Plato. He's an early myth analyst himself, and his sort of interpretations of his own myth, his own mythological culture, often very, very interesting. So that's going to be rewarding for you if you want to go off on your own and kind of get a little more. In addition to all the other texts we've wished we could add to the course variously, but that'd be my first suggestion.
Yeah, I would just add, if you wanted to do some secondary reading, some sort of scholarly reading, might be worth trying to pick up a copy of like a Cambridge Companion to Mythology, or there's Oxford Readings or the Blackwell Companion series. They're all really good sort of introduction to different scholarly takes on these subjects, and they're sort of most of them are short articles, so you can kind of dip in and get an idea, and they'd also give you a good starting point of bibliography of where else you could go if you wanted more of a scholarly take on mythology.
So there's a lot more out there, and we've just only skimmed the surface, and you all, I hope, can feel free to explore, and hopefully we've given you some ways in on your own exploration as you carry forward with your own study. This will be our last Screenside Chat, so there's another week of the course, but there's maybe an appropriate moment at this point to say goodbye to those of you out there. So thank you all for being a part of the class. The ongoing experiment is having a little bit more routine to it now, as we've done it several times, and that's sort of good to see. We're settling into a way that things work better than other ways, but we'll keep fine-tuning, and we, as always, appreciate your feedback and comments on the discussion forums as we move forward. So best of luck, all of you out there. Good luck with the reading. Read hard, read fast. Use all this knowledge only for good and never for evil. That's the best lesson I know. So good luck with it out there, and see you all next time. So long.
All right.
Let's see what I do here.